It is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's guest lecturer, Erik Baker. Mr. Baker is a lecturer on history of science at Harvard University and senior editor of The Drift. His dissertation, Entrepreneurial Management Expertise and the Reinvention of the American Work Ethic, won the 2023 Leo P. Rebuffo Prize from Society for U.S. Intellectual History, as well as Forum for History of Human Science Biennial Dissertation Prize. Mr. Baker's first book, Make Your Own Job, How the Entrepreneurial Work Ethic Exhausted America, was published 2025 by Harvard University Press. His essays have appeared, for example, in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Harper's, and The Nation. During our brief but rewarding acquaintance, I have come to know Mr. Baker as a thinker whose work is both academically excellent and seriously inquiring into our way of life in this historical epoch. Mr. Baker is a lively and dialogical conversationalist, and therefore I hope many of us can stay for the question period. Welcome, Mr. Baker.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and of course thank you to the college for hosting me. It's already been a remarkable visit. I was joking, I was thinking to myself, the line about St. John's is that you go to the cafeteria and students are actually talking about the reading, and I always kind of assumed, oh, this is just a kind of marketing thing. I've been around the block, and yet I was over there eating my dinner, and I overheard, I could not help but overhear a very rich set of conversations about the books and the curriculum. So it's great to be here sharing. This is actually the first time that I'm publicly presenting this new research that I've done since the publication of my book in January. And in fitting with my theme, the title of this talk is The Virtues of Technological Obsolescence. I have opted to eschew the PowerPoint presentation and focus on sharing my words with you all. When we worry about work disappearing, what exactly are we worried about? Recent advances in machine learning technology and so-called artificial intelligence have led to a new round of predictions about the impending end of work. But such abstract and apocalyptic formulas can encompass a range of distinct anxieties. On the one hand, there are concerns about widespread unemployment, fears that technological developments will soon deprive vast swaths of the workforce of their jobs, potentially permanently. While it would be unwise to dismiss these concerns too hastily, there's ample reason to treat them with some skepticism. Predictions of mass joblessness driven by technological change have cropped up since the early years of industrial capitalism and have almost always been frustrated. There's little evidence that generative AI will defy this trend. Rather than inducing mass unemployment, the sociologist Aaron Benenov has recently written, the more immediate effects of generative AI are likely to mirror broader trends of job transformation already unfolding today, namely de-skilling and surveillance. De-skilling, however, can often feel like the destruction of work in a more qualitative sense, the elimination of the aspects of an occupation that made it feel worthwhile or meaningful. I believe that when people express anxieties about AI making their work obsolete, they are often, though of course not always, preoccupied less with the risk of unemployment per se, and more with the prospect that they'll no longer be able to make a living performing specific activities they value. They like what they do and the way that they do it, whether they're teaching, writing, editing, designing, composing, illustrating, performing. And they fear that AI will make it harder for them to earn a living doing those things the way they're accustomed to, forcing them to find new jobs or to adopt new and unwanted technologies as a condition of their work. What they feel to be under threat is their work as they know it concretely, work as a strand woven into the total fabric of their lives, as opposed to work as an abstract exchange of productive effort for money. It is much harder to say that these concerns are misplaced. Technological change, since the rise of industrial capitalism, has undermined the commercial viability of many past modes of work, especially in agriculture and in goods production or manufacturing in the original sense of the term, making human-scale things with one's own hands and the tools they wield. When the United States was founded, nearly the entirety of its workforce was occupied in those two domains. Now, only a very small fraction works in agriculture, and fewer than 20% of workers are employed making or building tangible things, often under highly mechanized conditions that bear little resemblance to pre-industrial labor processes. In other words, the question looming over so many debates about generative AI, what would happen if machines acquired the ability to do the work many people do today for cheap and at a market acceptable quality, is no hypothetical. We've seen this scenario play out many times already with profound social and cultural ramifications. As I showed in my book, Make Your Own Job, an entrepreneurial work ethic centered around the need to perpetually create new job opportunities helped Americans accommodate themselves over the course of the 20th century to the cyclical disappearance of familiar forms of work, though not without significant costs. But not everyone got on board. As long as industrial capitalism has threatened traditional modes of labor, which is to say for the entirety of its history, people have sought to defend and preserve older ways of working and living. Since finishing Make Your Own Job, I've focused my research on the long and diverse tradition that has sought to defend and to celebrate technological obsolescence, with a focus on the US since the early 19th century. People who are concerned about technological change or who resist the adoption of new technologies are often depicted as motivated by an irrational fear of novelty. This condescending tendency has thrived since the Luddite insurrections in England over 2 centuries ago. Though interestingly enough, the Oxford English Dictionary cannot attest our current usage of that particular term, Luddite, as an insult before 1954. That some people are just psychologically indisposed to change cannot, of course, be denied. But my goal is to show that the deliberate embrace of obsolete technology both can and frequently has been rationally defensible, and rationally defensible even when fears that technological change would undermine workers' livelihoods in so-called purely material terms proved misguided or were simply not salient. My method here is akin to the approach in the history and philosophy of science, my field of origin, the philosopher Imre Lakatos called rational reconstruction. A range of psychological predilections, religious and aesthetic commitments, and other historical contingencies may have brought people over the years to the conclusion that they ought not employ certain state-of-the-art technologies to do their work. But once they've arrived at that conclusion, a great many of them have tried to explain their reasons for doing so. And often, especially I think when they're convincing, these explanations share a basic structure, one that can then be clarified through philosophical reflection. The foundation of this structure is, in my view, the concept of virtue, my understanding of which follows the lead of the late Alasdair MacIntyre in his great book, After Virtue. To summarize a very complex argument far too quickly, MacIntyre explicates virtue in 3 steps. First, MacIntyre suggests we attend to the way that the dispositions or qualities that come to mind when thinking of virtue enable us to participate in the forms of activity that he calls practices. Practices, in MacIntyre's sense, are shared activities that are partially defined by particular standards of excellence, the pursuit of which allows the attainment of goods that he describes as internal to the practice. So, it's possible to derive pleasure without playing chess, or so I've been told, but to execute a brilliant checkmate attack, you must play chess. And MacIntyre observes you must play it the right way. You must eschew, for instance, the use of computer programs that can quickly tell a player the best move to play in any given position, because a brilliant chess move performed at the instruction of a computer is no longer brilliant. That, in turn, requires one to possess a sufficient degree of dispositions such as integrity, self-mastery, and so on, which are, of course, familiar examples of the virtues. So this is the first step. But of course, MacIntyre recognizes that an account of virtue is that which allows us to achieve the internal goods of chess and other practices would appear rather deflationary. There are, after all, people who genuinely excel at chess, for instance, but who nonetheless lead lives one is rarely compelled to consider exemplary of the virtues. Bobby Fischer's descent into rabid anti-Semitism saying, or one contemporary grandmaster who's become so preoccupied with the possibility of his rival's cheating that in at least one case he leveled an incessant stream of baseless allegations that appear to have driven a fellow grandmaster to suicide. Virtue, then, while enabling the attainment of goods internal to practices, must also enable us to avoid mistaking any of these goods for the good as such, to sustain us, as MacIntyre puts it, in a kind of quest for the good. Virtue gives lives a sense of narrative unity in which particular practices are integrated through their contribution to a person's growing understanding of the good. This is step 2. Step 3 is to recognize that, as MacIntyre writes, I'm never able to seek for the good or exercise the virtues only in my capacity as an individual. Practices in the coherent individual lives into which their goods may be integrated only ever exist within a broader social context that MacIntyre calls a tradition. One may or may not agree with Wittgenstein that there cannot be a private language, but there is no doubt that there cannot be a private practice in MacIntyre's sense. Such an activity would resemble chess less than Calvin ball from the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip, the game whose only rule is that the same rules can't be used twice. Although even then, I suppose, that game still requires both a child and his imaginary friend. Similarly, the image of a quest for the good, giving narrative unity to a person's life, implies always a quest from a starting point which, for real human beings, is always given to us by our social circumstances. But for the social circumstances in which we find ourselves to give rise to practices and to a sustained search for the good, they must take a particular form. They must form a living tradition, in MacIntyre's words, an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. So, the practice of atonal composition, which my sister-in-law is engaged in, is incomprehensible, as my father-in-law can testify, apart from a tradition of argument about the nature of musical excellence. And a musician is able to integrate their musical practice into a unified narrative of their life to the extent that they have access to a tradition which furnishes resources for understanding the place of art in the good life. And these resources, of course, may include beliefs that can be both contested and rejected. The vitality of such a tradition, in turn, requires the virtues. A society characterized by widespread injustice, dishonesty, cowardice, and so on is not likely to sustain the kind of multi-generational collective inquiry into the good life in the context of which practices and coherent individual lives can develop. Thus, says MacIntyre, virtues sustain practices, coherent individual lives, and traditions in a kind of telescoping fashion. And so virtue, both the concept and the thing itself, is what makes moral reasoning possible, because the latter always involves a tradition in his sense. And for this conclusion, sadly, I must merely gesture to the arguments MacIntyre makes for it in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? Now, at this point, you might quite understandably be thinking to yourself, what does any of this have to do with work and technology? The answer, I think, begins with MacIntyre's habitual use of the word embodied to characterize practices, individual lives, and traditions. Embodiment in its biological dimension became a central theme of MacIntyre's work following after virtue, especially in his book Dependent Rational Animals. But technology is another dimension of embodiment, especially, though arguably not exclusively, for human beings. So to describe a practice, for example, as embodied, is to say that it is partially constituted by a particular set of technologies with which it can be enacted. We've already encountered an example, in fact. It is constitutive of the practice of chess that players arrive at their moves without computer assistance. Now, I said can be enacted because there are often a range of technologies that can embody a practice. A wooden or a plastic or a digital chessboard, for example, or handwriting, typewriting, and digital word processing in the practice of literary fiction. But this range is always finite. For any given practice, it is possible to imagine technological changes which would either transform the activity into a qualitatively new practice or deprive it of its character as a practice altogether. Imagine a group of people who previously earned money as professional chess players who agreed to be paid by an eccentric billionaire to show up each day to a warehouse in which they executed the chess moves prescribed by different computer programs on the board across from one another. Not only could they no longer be said to be playing chess, they would also no longer be engaged in a practice in MacIntyre's sense at all. They would merely have a rather bizarre job. And so here at last is where work enters the picture. For there are some kinds of work that are practices and others that are not. And as MacIntyre observes, the kind of work done by the vast majority of the inhabitants of the modern world cannot be understood in terms of the nature of a practice with goods internal to itself. MacIntyre himself cites farming as an example of a practice, about which I'll have much more to say momentarily. But for now, consider the manufacture of furniture. Until the late 19th century, this activity was unquestionably a practice. The pursuit of excellence in this practice entailed the attainment of a set of internal goods, for which the word craftsmanship may perhaps suffice as shorthand. In turn, the achievement of craftsmanship in furniture manufacturing required a characteristic set of virtues: diligence, care, and appreciation of beauty, and so on. Today, most furniture is mass-produced in highly automated factories. I would submit that this activity is not a practice, and for that reason, it does not require the virtues that craft production requires. It's not to say that it precludes them. A worker whose job is simply to push the right buttons in the right order may exhibit diligence, care, appreciation for beauty, and so on in their life as a whole, but they need not possess these dispositions in order to achieve goods internal to the practice of furniture mass production, because in fact, there are no such goods and no such practice. At this point, one might reasonably ask, so what? One activity losing its status as a practice does not mean that there aren't other practices for excellence in which virtue is required. And it's possible to imagine forms of work that are authentic practices, but which are pernicious for other reasons and ought to meet their end, like the Guild of Torturers in the great science fiction writer Gene Wolfe's book of the New Sun. But of course, technological change rarely comes to erode the practice character of a particular form of work in isolation. In historical fact, this kind of transformation has typically occurred systematically across a wide range of forms of work in a given society, encouraged by structural forces such as the logic of capital accumulation or the designs of a developmentalist state. In such circumstances, people can find themselves deprived of access to any work that could plausibly count as a practice. They may still engage in other practices, but these will have a more peripheral place in their life than that of a person who devotes themselves for the better part of most days to work that is a practice. In turn, I would like to submit that this marginalization of practice will have a corrosive effect on both the ability of individuals to understand their lives as a narrative unity and the ability of communities to form living traditions organized around the pursuit of the good. Here we may invert MacIntyre. Goods, he writes, can only be discovered by entering into those relationships which constitute communities whose central bond is a shared vision of an understanding of goods. Conversely, however, if there are few goods available in principle to a person for discovery, because as a point of social fact they have little choice but to orient their lives around the pursuit of instrumental or external goods, such as sensory enjoyment or the reproduction of their biological capabilities, there would be little point in entering into the kinds of communal relationships MacIntyre has in mind. Nor will one's life take on the character of a quest for the good into which the pursuit of various concrete goods is progressively integrated. It will only appear as the repetitive attainment of the same basic goods, a minimal set very close to the set of human necessities. Such a life is one which will have little need for the virtues, and if MacIntyre is right, and I think he is at least on this score, that means it is a life in which it will become progressively more difficult to reason morally. Two conclusions follow from all of this, the first of which will sum up what I've said so far, and the second of which will frame what I would like to say with the rest of my time tonight. The first conclusion is that it may indeed be reasonable to oppose and to actively resist technological changes that tend to undermine the practice character of work, even when one's livelihood in material terms is not in jeopardy. And this is because the ability to devote one's life to a significant degree to participation in practices is a precondition for reasoning about the good life in the first place. The second conclusion is that for such resistance to succeed on its own terms, it must take a social and eventually communal form. Not only are practices themselves inherently social, but they can only sustain lives in which the virtues anchor moral reasoning in the context of a shared living tradition. As MacIntyre writes, it is always within some particular community with its own specific institutional forms that we learn or fail to learn to exercise the virtues. That means that what is imperiled by objectionable technological changes to forms of work can only be defended ultimately in community. And this is actually what we can find in the historical record. When technological obsolescence is practiced intentionally, it is always practiced in one way or another collectively, or at least aspirationally collectively. But this is easier said than done. It's very difficult to live and work below the standard of technology established in capitalist markets, which is of course why the introduction of capitalist social relations is historically associated with the acceleration of technological development. While an individual might have some luck figuring out how to make a living for themselves working with obsolete technology, it takes a lot of effort to replicate that at any scale, to create a real community in which the practices people wish to sustain can flourish and find their place in a living tradition. In my historical research, I found that sustaining communities centered around obsolescence has typically required the pursuit of at least one of three strategies. I'd like to outline them briefly and then show you how Dorothy Day's Catholic worker movement, Wendell Berry's agrarian vision, and the lo-fi music scene illustrate each of them in turn. The first strategy is participation in mass political struggle. If the generalized condition of dependence on the market imposed by the structure of capitalist society is what makes communities unified by an embrace of technological obsolescence difficult to sustain, then the ultimate solution would be structural economic transformation against and beyond capitalism, the creation of a new form of social life where people can live and work the way they would like without having to worry about their access to the basic necessities of life. Speaking of things that are easier said than done, this strategy has obviously not yet achieved its final goal in this country, which is not to say that it has been a waste of time or borne no fruit. A second strategy, attractive to those discouraged by the long odds facing the mass politics strategy, is separatism, the creation of self-sufficient communities that break in a radical way with the rest of society. Since the early industrial era, this strategy has most commonly been pursued by religious movements, but especially since the 1960s, secular communities have also formed in the hope of sustaining themselves through a shared commitment to low-tech work methods and every variety of necessary labor. This strategy is, of course, not without its disadvantages as well. Joining such a community typically requires participants to make significant sacrifices. A person may feel a desire to defend particular work practices from technological change without being interested in relinquishing a range of modern conveniences. The rewards of doing what one loves to do with traditional methods may not outweigh the disadvantages of pre-modern plumbing. Separatist communities also often tend to reestablish traditional social hierarchies as well, sometimes despite the aspirations of their founders, but sometimes intentionally. In particular, the virtues that those attracted to separatist communities may wish to protect have often included gendered norms of conduct that others have found alienating or objectionable. The final strategy, attractive to those with no desire to break entirely with the modern world, is marketing, creating a dedicated consumer base for the products of work produced with obsolete technologies. In case there is somehow anyone here who has read my book, this strategy dovetails with the phenomenon of countercultural entrepreneurship that I discuss in Make Your Own Job. Consumers attracted to the perceived authenticity or quality enabled by traditional low-tech methods may pay a premium that outweighs the costliness of those methods. In some ways, this strategy is clearly the most straightforward way to keep technologically obsolete work practices alive, if that is all one cares about, but that is very rarely all that people care about, which makes the marketing strategy risky. The requirements of operating a commercially competitive business may jeopardize the very virtues, the cultivation of which was the aim of rejecting state-of-the-art technology in the first place. With this framework in place, now at last we can get more concrete. The Catholic worker movement is a useful place to start because in my view it's both the earliest and the most productive outcome in the US of the encounter between modern mass labor radicalism on the one hand, and on the other, the tradition of skeptical interrogation of the social consequences of modernity that arose in the 19th century, chiefly in Europe, and which was closely associated with the Catholic Church. Like Alasdair MacIntyre himself, Dorothy Day was a socialist sympathetic to Marxism who later became a Catholic. Born in 1897 to a peripatetic sports writer and his wife, Day moved to the East Village in Manhattan after 2 years at the University of Illinois, and quickly established herself as a writer and personality in the left-wing bohemian scene that thrived in lower Manhattan during the run-up to American entry into World War I. Like many in that milieu, Day was attracted to anarchism as well as radical anti-capitalism, and associated closely with organizers of the Industrial Workers of the World, the anarcho-syndicalist One Big Union. Day's lifelong interest in Christianity became more pronounced in the 1920s, a period when the pre-war left fell into abeyance amidst the repression of the first Red Scare, and during which she moved to a home in a then rural part of Staten Island. There she decided that she wanted to have a child, and that she wanted the child to be baptized in the Catholic Church. In December 1927, the winter after the birth of her daughter, Tamar, Day herself officially converted. The advent of the Great Depression reignited the American labor movement and Day's own interest in radical politics. She began to report on the era's political upheaval in Catholic periodicals, with a mounting sense of frustration at what she perceived as the Church's relative disinterest, at best, in supporting the workers' movement. According to the story that she told many times for the rest of her life, she prayed for guidance on how to better contribute to the struggle for labor justice while visiting Washington, D.C. to support the 1932 Hunger March. When she returned to New York, she found Peter Maurin on her doorstep. Maurin was, in many ways, Day's polar opposite. 20 years older, the child of a French peasant family, an undocumented immigrant to the U.S., a lifelong Catholic who's extremely confident in himself and his ideas, where Day was relentlessly self-scrutinizing and self-effacing. But they shared a conviction that Catholic teaching, properly understood, demanded a radical challenge to all modern political economic structures. Day gave Maurin access to the broader radical community in the U.S., as well as a pragmatic sensibility he sorely lacked and a genius for relationship building. Maurin, in turn, gave Day a programmatic vision, a theoretically sophisticated account of what was wrong with modern life and what to do about it. Maurin's diagnosis began with work. In Peter's vision, work is a gift, Day later wrote, given for the common good, and the reason why one works is to share gifts and talents in common with others to help create a better kind of society. Work, properly understood in its full theological significance, was a kind of sacrament, a way of enacting God's creative love. This view immediately resonated with Day, whose experience working as a nurse during the 1918 influenza pandemic convinced her that work could be, at least under the right circumstances, an act of worship, in her words. But the circumstances were rarely right. The chief culprit was what the Catholic workers commonly referred to as the mechanization of industry, a phenomenon that someone of Maurin's age and agrarian background would have seen unfold in her own lifetime. In mechanized industry, work lost its quality as a way to cultivate and share the gifts God gave each person. To think is dangerous at a machine, an article in the movement's newspaper later proclaimed. The danger was not so much the loss of the hand or the arm, but the loss of one's soul, for when one ceases to think and becomes a machine himself, the devil enters in. The mechanized worker, in other words, could not live a fully virtuous life. Maurin expounded his program for preserving virtue in the face of the mechanization of industry with his characteristic rhetorical flair and penchant for catchy slogans. It was a program to create a society in which it is easier for people to be good, he said, to build a new society within the shell of the old, in the phrase that he and Day adopted knowingly from the preamble to the IWW Constitution. The plan had 3 pillars, which he dubbed cult, culture, and cultivation. These terms appear in order of their importance to Maurin, but in reverse order of their chronological priority. Cultivation would come first, the reestablishment of a sacramental relationship to work, where people could devote themselves to providing homes, food, and clothing to those who needed them, not as commodities, but as spiritually laden gifts. A life built around such self-giving would enable individuals to, in Day's words, develop their capacities for love and worship expressed in all the arts. They would grow in culture in the 19th century sense of the word, an appreciation for and understanding of the higher goods in life. And such individuals would, Maurin believed, eventually find God. They would be prepared to revitalize the religious institutions that, as Maurin and Day each maintained, were becoming increasingly irrelevant and peripheral to the lives of people in modern societies. In other words, Maurin envisioned people ascending through participation in practices to a life-unifying quest for the good, and ultimately to a living tradition, a journey throughout which the virtues would reacquire their logic. Maurin's plan for making this grand vision a reality, and I should say at least Day always insisted it was Maurin's plan and she merely implemented it, though I have some skepticism, was more concrete, although still tripartite. A wholesale rejection of mechanized industry entailed a return to farming communes, or what he preferred to call agronomic universities, to emphasize that the work that took place there was not merely primitive for its own sake, but a passage to the higher achievements of cult and culture. The fact that few would heed the call to return to the land, at least at first, also entailed the need for houses of hospitality, which Maurin saw as a modern renovation of the medieval hospice. City dwellers could devote their lives to sacramental work by performing what the church called the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, caring for the sick, visiting those in prison. Everyone should be able to place his job in the category of the works of mercy, Day once declared. This work would be coordinated and run out of communities analogous to the agronomic university, perhaps even subsisting on the surplus of those farms along with donated food. Finally, both the agronomic universities and the houses of hospitality would host lively and regular intellectual inquiry. Maurin's unusually uninspiring phrase was roundtable discussions, which did emphasize, however, the egalitarian character that he thought that such collective search for the good would need to take. So this whole scheme, agronomic universities, houses of hospitality, and roundtable discussions, would in turn be publicized through a newspaper published as anti-commercially as the medium would permit. It is not hard to sympathize with Day's conviction, always implicit and not infrequently explicit in her writings, that divine providence was necessary to explain how the Catholic worker movement actually managed to implement something very much like this program. If so, Day herself was surely the divine's chief vessel. Her immensely appealing writerly presence, charismatic and penetrating, but never self-righteous, and always palpably uncynical, made it difficult to read the Catholic worker without coming away rooting for the movement's de facto leader. And her extraordinary patience and faith in constructive dialogue helped keep the movement's early experiments in communal living from fracturing. The houses of hospitality came first. Originally, the first operated out of a barber shop below Day's 15th Street apartment, which had also become the newspaper's headquarters. A few years later, in the mid-30s, the Catholic workers founded a 1-acre communal farm on Staten Island, and another shortly afterwards in Easton, Pennsylvania. These experiments, especially the houses of hospitality, quickly attracted emulators that the movement's decentralized structure accommodated easily. And all Catholic worker communities displayed a commitment to intellectual dialogue, frequently with the nomadic Maurin in attendance, which, I should say, could frustrate those whose priority was to ensure the smooth functioning of the farms and the houses. While Day shared Maurin's belief in building a new society in the shell of the old, her experience on the left during the first Red Scare gave her a more profound appreciation than Maurin of the way that the shell of the old can sometimes constrict to crush the new being incubated. For this reason, she maintained a conviction that the Catholic worker movement would need to engage with broader, even secular political movements against the forces of state and capital that threatened to make the work closest to her heart impossible. Catholic workers showed up to picket lines and welcomed striking workers into their houses of hospitality, where they were not only fed and sheltered, but also, Day wrote with pride, where they read, they talked, and they had time to think. During World War II, the movement collaborated with Quakers and Mennonites to create camps where conscientious objectors could perform civilian service in lieu of enlisting, and Catholic workers continued to agitate against the rise of the national security state in the Cold War, supported Vietnam draft resistors. The Catholic worker newspaper spoke out against racial segregation from its founding, its very first issue in the 1930s, and Catholic workers contributed actively to the racial justice movements of the 1960s. The last of Day's many lifetime arrests came in 1973 at the age of 75 on a picket line in California for the United Farm Workers Union founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. By that time, the early 1970s, the American left, and especially the labor movement, was poised on the precipice of a retreat not unlike that prompted by the Red Scares that followed the 2 world wars. The achievements of the mass movements of the preceding decades were not inconsiderable, of course. The end of Jim Crow, general public disillusionment with the Vietnam War, the first federal environmental legislation, and unprecedented experiences of empowerment and dignity among women and gay people. By the waning years of the Nixon administration, further victories did not seem forthcoming, and those that had been attained seem to have done little to fundamentally redress the aspects of modern industrial society that had galvanized earlier 20th century radicals. and in the eyes of traditionalist conservative critics of modernity, at least some of the achievements of the social movements of the 60s actually did more harm than good. Wendell Berry, who turned 91 this summer, has always rejected the conservative label, but he is unquestionably a traditionalist. And his rise to intellectual and literary prominence coincided with his deepening skepticism about the moral possibilities of mass politics. In one of his most famous early essays, collected in the 1972 volume, A Continuous Harmony, Berry encouraged his readers to, his slogan, think small. While Berry shared the outrage that motivated the activists of his era, he explained, he felt their mass political form, focused on large-scale structural and institutional change, doomed them to futility. The civil rights movement and the peace movement, as popular causes in the electronic age, have partaken far too much of the nature of fads, he lamented. Despite his support for their aims, Berry deemed them to have made a set of counterproductive compromises with the culture of mass consumerism, and he worried that the nascent environmentalist movement would follow the same path. In 5 years, he predicted, the energy of our present concern will have petered out in a series of public gestures and no doubt in a series of empty laws. Berry's advice for those who were justifiably concerned about the fate of the environment was not to show up to protests or to petition their representatives, but rather to start a garden. A person who undertakes to grow a garden at home by practices that will preserve rather than exploit the economy of the soil has set his mind decisively against what is wrong with us, Berry wrote. In this early piece, Berry did no more than sketch the outlines of an argument for this conclusion, but he could never, in fact, be accused of failing to practice what he preached. Raised in a fifth-generation Kentucky farming family, Berry discerned a vocation as a writer and left home to pursue a literary career, studying with Wallace Stegner in a famous seminar at Stanford, traveling to Europe on a Guggenheim Fellowship, and teaching at New York University in the early 60s. In 1964, however, Berry accepted a job at the University of Kentucky and purchased a small farm very close to where he'd grown up. Berry and his wife initially envisioned using the farm as a summer home when they weren't in Lexington, but they eventually threw themselves into farming wholeheartedly, even as Berry managed to still produce a steady stream of novels, short stories, poems, and essays. By the late 70s, they were able to obtain their food primarily from the land, and Berry left his teaching job. Before I had lived according to expectation rooted in ambition, he later wrote, now I began to live according to a kind of destiny rooted in my origins and in my life. The Berry farm was scrupulously low-tech. No chemical fertilizers, no insecticides except for a little rotenone, a composting privy, a wood-burning stove, and most remarkably, a team of horses rather than a tractor. Berry's most comprehensive defense of the importance of resisting the seductions of state-of-the-art agricultural technology came in his 1977 book, The Unsettling of America, still probably his best-known work of nonfiction. His logic followed what should by now be a familiar structure. Technological change had created an agriculture in which virtue was no longer required. Beneath the ecological crisis, Berry argued, lay a crisis of character. Just as the agricultural crisis, the near extinction of farming as a viable livelihood for individuals outside of agribusiness, was at its root a crisis of culture, full stop. In pre-industrial agrarian societies, Berry argued, lives, skills, and tools were culturally indivisible, a unity which formed the nest in which character was nurtured. Skill, in the best sense, Berry wrote, is the practical understanding of value. It would not be too tendentious, I think, to say that Berry understood skill as the kind of excellence required to attain the internal goods of practices such as farming, or at least farming as it once was. The machines employed in industrial agriculture were meant, in his words, to replace skill and thus come between us and life. The consequence of agricultural mechanization was an instrumental, or as he put it, specialist attitude toward work that eventually diffused throughout all of society. Specialization ripped work out of the fabric of a whole human life, a calamitous disintegration and scattering out of the various functions of character, Berry wrote, such as workmanship, care, conscience, and responsibility. Repairing this disintegration, in Berry's view, required the use of low-tech methods, but it also required the reformation of the communities and the cross-generational traditions in the context of which the practice of farming had once served to shape virtuous individuals. Virtue, Berry wrote, cannot exist alone. And I should say wrote 4 years before the publication of After Virtue. Virtue cannot exist alone. It must be a A virtue must lead to harmony between one creature and another. Like Peter Maurin, Berry was delighted by the etymological relationship between the words cult, culture, and cultivation, which to him revealed the integral relationship between the practice of farming, the orderly arrangement of the various goods in a single life, and collective traditions of reverence and appreciation for sacred mystery. For Berry, the uniquely close relationship between farming and communal tradition derived from the importance of place to the nature of agricultural skill. To be a good farmer, Berry maintained, was never a matter of possessing an abstract body of knowledge, but of being able to successfully cultivate this piece of land. And the best way to acquire that ability was to be raised in a community that had been cultivating this piece of land for generations, each one passing down what it had learned to the next. Berry liked to explain that he farmed his land with a team of horses, not out of an antiquarian disposition, but because he had learned growing up in that country that tractors could destroy the arability of very hilly terrain, like that which his homestead occupied, in a way that animals would not. It was this ability to recognize when powerful technologies ought not to be used that exemplified the kind of skill that could only be learned in the context of a living tradition. Mastering this skill, in turn, required patience, humility, and a love of wisdom, these virtues and others. Berry recognized, however, that like Humpty Dumpty, once they were broken apart, agrarian communities were quite difficult to put back together again. Berry's favorite example of the kind of community he had in mind was the Amish. In The Unsettling of America, Berry went so far as to argue that the Amish may well be the last surviving white community of any considerable size in this country, making allowance for some of the original inhabitants of this continent whose dispossession and oppression Berry has never allowed to escape from view. The Amish, Berry wrote, hold themselves aloof from the ambitions of a machine-based society, and as a result have maintained the integrity of their families, their community, their religion, and their way of life. This radical separatism is, I think, the logical conclusion of Berry's skepticism of mass politics and his emphasis on place. He has never been under any illusion that his own return to his ancestral fields has managed to produce a form of life at all adequate to his own standard. This awareness sets much of his work within a tragic frame that has only grown more pronounced over the course of his life. My walks in the hills and hollows around my home have inevitably produced in my mind the awareness that I live in a diminished country, Berry wrote in an elegiac 1988 essay. I still believe that a change for the better is possible, but I confess that my belief is partly hope and partly faith. It does indeed require a considerable degree of hope and faith to become a low-tech farmer, in the aspiration that the kind of community in which this practice can anchor a truly whole and virtuous life may one day, against all odds, rematerialize around you. In the meantime, the disadvantages are many. The social isolation that comes from living in a place in a state of communal decay, the economic challenges, which Berry, to his credit, has never downplayed, of acquiring and maintaining a farm from which one can actually subsist without needing to do other work, and of course, everything that the phrase composting privy entails. And there is the fact that the kinds of traditional agrarian communities Berry idolizes, often characterized by, almost by definition, traditional relation of gender and sexuality, which many of us may have good reason for rejecting. A 1987 essay in Harper's explaining why he would never buy a computer, in which Berry alluded rather casually to the fact that his wife typed all of his work, elicited a storm of feminist critique, to which Berry responded with a posture of bewildered indignation that won a few critics over. Was it possible to resist the degradation of practices by technology and to find a community in which the virtues could enable individuals to integrate their participation into practices into a collective search for the good life without abandoning the city and its distinctively modern pleasures and freedoms? That, so I've come to believe, was the aspiration of the constellation of musicians who, beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, began deliberately producing recorded popular music with technology that achieved lower fidelity than the commercial standard. Lo-fi music, in short. Like others, I will be referring to this as a movement, the lo-fi movement, because in my view it clearly was a movement, however much some of its members like to insist that they were guided by their personal aesthetic vision alone, rather than any programmatic commitments. In fact, I think that this sense of many lo-fi musicians, which I see no reason to doubt, in other words, that they grasped the appeal of certain quite radical aesthetic ideas without intellectual mediation, is a consequence of the fact that they inhabited a tradition, a living tradition which came eventually to need the defense of a movement against the effects of a certain kind of industrialization and the technology that accompanied it. This was the tradition of what I'd like to call rock primitivism. Originally, it emerged principally from a quite local face-to-face community, the bohemian art scene that thrived in the 60s in Lower Manhattan, on the same streets, in fact, in which Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin founded the Catholic Worker. This community reacted against the commercialization of rock and roll by the mainstream music industry in the late 50s and early 60s, which it critiqued in the name of the virtues of artistic integrity, authenticity, and realness. Folk revival purists maintained that these virtues required a strict adherence to traditional musical forms and instruments, while other artists, like the Velvet Underground, whose precursor group was in fact named the Primitives, sought instead to use ideas from contemporary experimental art composition, which emphasized spontaneity in the subconscious, to create a challenging and sonically raw form of rock music. The realness of artists from the 60s New York scene, like Bob Dylan and the Velvets, influenced the development of punk rock in the 1970s across the US and in the UK. Punk rockers could participate in the tradition of rock primitivism in a variety of ways. Transgressive lyrics, unpolished musicianship, energetic songs with simple chord progressions played fast and loud. One distinguishing feature of the punk ethos, especially in New York City, was a commitment to live performance over recorded music. Some influential New York punks, like Patti Smith, the Ramones, Television, and others, played for years in clubs before ever entering a recording studio. And punk records often emphasized capturing the feel of a band's live performance over the studio experimentation associated with rival contemporary genres like progressive rock. This aspect of punk helped set the stage in the 70s and early 80s for the release by major artists of unfinished and decidedly lo-fi demo recordings. Bob Dylan's Basement Tapes, for example, was recorded with the band in 1967, but not released until the pivotal punk year of 1975. Well, Bruce Springsteen's 1982 album, Nebraska, subject of a very bad movie that has recently departed from theaters, was written and recorded during a period when Springsteen was listening almost exclusively to the New York punk-adjacent band Suicide. By the early 1980s, the music industry had been working for years to assimilate punk into mainstream commercial music, ultimately producing the controversial genre known as New Wave, in which former punks or punk admirers played a more danceable, slickly produced take on the music, often with the use of synthesizers. Loyalists to the tradition of rock primitivism responded to New Wave by developing what became known as hardcore punk. Even more so than the punk of the 1970s, hardcore was a lifestyle as well as a genre. "Our band could be your life," the California hardcore group Minutemen sang, a line that gave the journalist Michael Azarid's great 2001 book on the scene its title. In hardcore, music was neither a job nor a commodity, but a practice, a thread woven into the seamless fabric of a single life. This required commitment to the ethos of do-it-yourself, or DIY. More of you comes through because there's less outside stuff you're sticking on, Minutemen co-founder Mike Watt told Azarid, explaining the group's self-dubbed econo approach. The hardcore hope was that by devoting oneself to a community that established and enforced, at the risk of obnoxiousness, a set of shared values like DIY, musicians could become themselves in a way they couldn't in the wasteland of Reagan-era suburbia. "I wanted to be part of some vocal, active, revolutionary gang/tribe/family/community," Minor Threat vocalist and DC hardcore luminary Ian MacKaye later recalled. "If I wasn't going to be raised with a culture that went beyond my immediate family, then I damn sure was going to create one." On January 11th, 1992, Billboard announced that the fastest-selling record in America was the second album by a band from Aberdeen, Washington, that played a style of music that blended hardcore punk with the influence of heavy metal. Nirvana's first album had come out on the independent Seattle label Sub Pop, but this new one, Nevermind, was pressed by the major label imprint DCG. By April, its lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, was certified platinum. Hardcore bands had signed with major labels before, sold out in the parlance of the community, but Nirvana's success confirmed that these artists were not aberrations and established a new standard of commercial dominance. The stream of major label talent scouts that had been trickling into hardcore shows since the mid-'80s became a torrent, and those punks loyal to the DIY ethos had to reckon with the fact that the mere sound of their music, intensely distorted, loud, fast, lyrically tormented, was no insurance against co-option by the corporate ogre, in the memorable words of Calvin Johnson, the founder of the militantly indie Northwest label K Records, and an erstwhile Kurt Cobain acquaintance. Cobain himself was sympathetic to Johnson's perspective. He had a tattoo of the K Records logo, in fact, and his deepening discomfort with his own success and its symbolic meaning exacerbated the mental health struggles that drove him to his tragic death. At the 1992 MTV Awards, Cobain showed up wearing a t-shirt that featured the hand-drawn cover of a 1983 record by the Texas musician Daniel Johnston called Hi, How Are You?, the unfinished album. Like his preceding albums, Johnson recorded Hi, How Are You on a monaural boombox he purchased in the late 70s for $59, and he released it himself on cassette, distributing copies outside of the McDonald's in Austin, where he worked. Johnston's music was decidedly not hardcore punk. It focused on his amateurish acoustic guitar and chord organ playing, and his disarmingly simple lyrics, often described by the critics who discovered his work through Cobain as childlike. It was arguably not even rock music. But as Cobain recognized, with equal parts respect and self-reproach, it was punker than punk, a more significant contribution to the tradition of rock primitivism than anything Nirvana released, not because of its sound, but because, above all, of its technology. A range of artists arrived at the same conclusion in the early 90s. In fact, some of them had even started thinking along these lines when the first hardcore bands started to sell out earlier in the 80s. Unencumbered by Cobain's fame, they were able to take it to its logical conclusion. K Records founder Calvin Johnson's band Beat Happening was an early pillar of the scene. So was the Ohio band Guided by Voices, the Massachusetts band Sebadoh, and the California band Pavement. These artists employed cheap, substandard recording techniques. Like Daniel Johnston, they were especially fond of the boombox. They also often took direct lyrical aim at the commercialization of hardcore punk and what was beginning to be called in the 90s indie rock. Give the finger to the rock and roll singer as he's dancing upon your paycheck, sang the California artist Beck, who recorded an album for K Records in 1993. I saw you on TV, sneered Beck's California acquaintance John Darnielle, who recorded music on a boombox under the name The Mountain Goats in his scathing anti-music song, doing a bad imitation of a second-rate songwriter from the 80s named, this is his pronunciation, Morrissey. I never liked Morrissey, and I don't like you. A 1993 New York Times article and a follow-up piece the next year popularized the label lo-fi to describe this reaction. As the latter article recognized, lo-fi was an attempt to extend a tradition that was rooted in rock and roll history, these are the writer's words, not my own, by refusing to adopt state-of-the-art recording techniques, instead adopting for cheap home tape recorders and other obsolete devices. In a world of sterile, digitally recorded top 40, lo-fi elucidates the raw seams of the artistic process, the Times article explained. Rawness, of course, had always been a value of the tradition of rock primitivism, but earlier approaches to embodying that value, playing sloppily an abrasive, noisy tone, screaming instead of singing, extreme lyrical content, no longer sufficed in an era where Nirvana topped the charts doing all of that. Obsolete technology in these circumstances was indispensable to the survival of the tradition. Lo-fi musicians had to eat too, though. Calvin Johnson hoped that indie labels like K Records could provide artists with enough commercial distribution to allow them to focus on their music more than they would have otherwise. He also envisioned the label as the nucleus of a genuine artistic community in its hometown of Olympia, Washington. As the corporate ogre expands its creeping influence on the minds of industrialized youth, the time has come for the international rockers of the world to convene in celebration of our grand independence, Johnson wrote in a manifesto announcing a Woodstock-like music festival hosted by Kay in Olympia, referencing, I should note, the early 20th century anarcho-syndicalist union that inspired Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin to call to build a new society within the shell of the old. This society is sick and in desperate need of a little bloodletting, Johnson rhapsodized. Sand, sidewalk, and punk pop implosion. We are the misfits and we will have our day. At least some of the lo-fi misfits had their day more than Johnson ever anticipated. Beck became a megastar shortly after completing his K Records album. He ended up signing to DGC, Nirvana's label. By the turn of the millennium, the Chicago musician Liz Phair, who began her career emulating Daniel Johnston and self-releasing audio cassettes with her music, had signed to Capitol Records and embraced an overtly pop rock sound. Some lo-fi purists reacted to this commercial success from within their milieu, which was unexpected to them even after Nirvana, by doubling down on local community. Calvin Johnson, for example, has continued to sponsor convivial gatherings of musicians in Olympia, though with deliberately less fanfare, while some of his collaborators left Olympia in the early aughts to return to the more rural Northwest towns where they're from. Other lo-fi musicians in the late 90s and early aughts took a political turn. While political, lyrical content had been common in hardcore and its predecessors in the rock primitivist tradition, the turn of the millennium saw the proliferation of bands that explicitly identified themselves with broader political movements, especially feminism, queer liberation, and anarchism. For Laura Jane Grace, founder and frontwoman of the lo-fi anarcho-punk band Against Me, a low-technology approach, eschewing electric instruments and studio manipulation, went hand in hand with her band's desire to be useful to a wider activist cause. Against Me was very much a band that was born from the radical activist scene, and we came up playing at Food Not Bombs gatherings or Mayday gatherings, she recalled in a recent interview. Part of the original approach of being an acoustic punk band was so that we wouldn't have to rely on electricity and we could play shows like that in a forest or by a campfire. Grace's story is a reminder that the three strategies of technological obsolescence I've outlined for you tonight are ideal types. Each of my exemplars embodied aspects of all three strategies, even if I think they usefully illustrate in turn what the relative prioritization of mass politics, separatism, and marketing can look like in practice. With that said, I can now make explicit what I'm sure many of you have already surmised. De te fabula narratur, as Marx was fond of quoting from Horace. About you, the story is told. Like working people elsewhere in our society, all of us in academic and intellectual life are confronting the prospect of rapid technological change in the form of generative AI. I believe that generative AI is an existential threat to the status of critical reading, writing, and teaching as practices, to the communities in which I, to speak personally, have learned how to narrate my own life as a search for the good, and to the tradition of serious intellectual inquiry, to which this college's curriculum is, of course, a beautiful testament. No less than Dorothy Day's Catholic workers, Wendell Berry's farmers, and the lo-fi movement's rock musicians, we have reason to resist this technological change, even if it turns out that we can retain our ability to get paid to do something that is called reading, writing, or teaching using generative AI. And I believe that successful resistance will require a canny combination of all three strategies I've outlined for you tonight. It will require us to figure out how to capture whatever money in our society still might be able to be allocated to institutions devoted to the practices we value. But it will also require some difficult thinking about how to create communities with a robust ability to sustain themselves, even when such commercial support is not forthcoming. And it will require, I'm convinced, a commitment to mass political struggle in solidarity with all the other workers in our society who have a stake in confronting the power that a small class of economic tyrants seem bent on wielding to shove this technology down our throats. I share with McIntyre and with Day a theology that holds that the desire for the good is universal, indeed, a transcendental condition of human consciousness. That means that the project of building a society in which it is easier for people to be good, by eschewing technologies that jeopardize their ability to lead lives for which virtue is a necessity, is potentially universal as well. Thank you.